Well, hello. My name's Adrian Gilbert, and I'd like to welcome you back to the Invisible College. I'm assuming that if you are seeing this, that you already know this. So I'm just going to press straight on and get on with this present lecture, which is called A Revolution in Evolution. And in this lecture, we're going to discuss the work of Charles Darwin and why I believe that it needs, really it needs complete change, complete overhaul. That we now have enough information to see that it is not a valid idea, that we need to go further than this and to find out what's really going on with the development of life on Earth. So let's just press on and see where this takes us. So now, Charles Darwin, he's the father of the theory of evolution. And he wrote a famous book called On the Origin of Species, which was published in 1859. And at the forefront of that book, you can see it here on the left-hand page here, he put in a couple of quotes which I think are quite telling, that they reveal how he was actually rather unsure of what he was writing at the time, and therefore he felt the need to back himself up with some eminent quotes, one from his own time and the other going back several centuries. And I'll just read these out to you quickly. But with regard to the material world, we can at least go so far as this. We can perceive that events are brought about not by insulated interpositions of divine power, that means God, exerted in each particular case, but by the establishment of general laws, in other words, through science. And then he quotes from Francis Bacon, who's probably the great philosopher of science from the early 17th century. And he wrote, "To conclude, therefore, let no man out of a weak conceit of sobriety or an ill-applied moderation think or maintain that a man can search too far or be too well studied in the book of God's word," I mean that's the Bible, "or in the book of God's works," and that's nature or natural philosophy, divinity or philosophy. But we rather let man endeavour to endless progress or proficience in both. So he's saying that you can't have too much knowledge. You shouldn't hold yourself back from investigating both the Bible and nature to find the truth about these works of God and to see our position within it. And Darwin's positioning himself here. He's guarding against criticism from religion on one side and from people of a scientific disposition on the other, who think, like Aristotle, that, yeah, we know enough now, we must stop trying to learn more. He's guarding himself against that, saying, look, we've got to push out, we've got to find new theories, we've got to not be held back, we've got to go forwards. And I agree with him on that. So let's press on ourselves. Darwin's central propositions are that species evolve from one form to another by means of incremental adaptations, that the species which survive, that's plural species, are those whose adaptations prove to be advantageous over their rivals who do not. So in other words, adaptations have to be made, small incremental adaptations, and those who make the right adaptations are the ones that survive. And the causes of adaptation were, he thought, random. For example, one animal might spontaneously develop a slightly longer beak, or a different colour, or some other slight change. Over a period of time, perhaps the progeny of this better adapted individual would predominate, and so the species would change. So he's presenting this case that small things happen spontaneously, and over a given period of time, if those changes turn out to be advantageous, that species will predominate, and that those who have that change will predominate, whereas those who don't will go extinct. And he writes here that challenging situations requiring adaptation could be climatic, that's changing climate, the presence of competitors and diseases, lack of food, or some other stressor that favoured the fit over the unfit. Right? So these natural things could be happening which give one species an advantage, or even a subspecies an advantage over its competitors who are almost the same but not quite. And that one predominates. And with small incremental changes, you could move from a lizard, say, to a mouse. This is kind of what he's saying. And Darwin came up with the idea that all life forms have developed from a common ancestor. Pathways of evolution to different species formed a dendritic, which means to say a tree pattern of relationships. There were branches and twigs leading off in all directions to the variegated life forms we see today. So this is actually Darwin's own diagram, and you can see at the bottom here there's a number 1. That's the sort of the first life form, perhaps the first amoeba or whatever it was that was the first living species. And then you've got these branches coming out. You've got one that goes down here to his letter A, which would have gone extinct. And then you've got others coming up here, and then you've got D, B, C. And that's how he felt that things had developed in dendritic form, to give us all the different animals, different fish, birds, plants, everything. So this tree included all life forms, from microbes to plankton to fish to amphibians, birds and animals, also to all forms of plant life, from the most basic mosses and grasses to flowering shrubs, trees and toadstools. There were also species and indeed whole branches that have become extinct, for example dinosaurs. These, for whatever reason, did not manage to adapt to changing conditions and therefore died out. And Darwin's tree of life, enlarged and developed much further, is still taught today. It's taught in schools, taught in universities, taught on television. Everywhere you look, you'll find this kind of diagram. Not maybe exactly this one, but you will find this kind of diagram with all the different species and branches showing their relationship one to another and coming back to an original, the beginnings of life right at the bottom. Now then, by the start of the 1880s, the divergence between science and what is taught about Genesis at the start of the Bible was becoming acute. Many scholars were becoming increasingly skeptical that this world and the universe beyond were created by God. Because, you know, if you study the Bible, and as I said, he's saying you've got to study nature and you've got to study the Bible and do the two together. That's what Francis Bacon taught. Well, but there's this divergence. In the Bible, in Genesis, it says God creates everything in 7 days. And people say, you know, well, that was accepted as truth for you know, probably 1800 years. But then people come along, and particularly Darwin, and say, well, you know, so you have this divergence between what's sort of it's saying in the Word of God, the Bible, and what we're observing in nature, and particularly in the fossil record, which shows this long periods of time between species. We now date the Earth, I think I'm right in saying, to something like 4 billion years old. And life forms, I think we're talking about 600 million or something of that period. A long time, not more than 7 days. So you had this problem coming up with the divergence. And Darwin's theory provided a rational explanation for how the diversity of life could exist in the absence of any creator God. Darwinism became in effect a substitute religion with him as its prophet. Now that might sound kind of an absurd thing to say, but we have a need to understand where we come from. We have a need for what's called cosmogenesis, which is the birth of the universe, and anthropogenesis, the birth of man or mankind. I'm going to be doing other lectures on those subjects in other places. I'm not going to go into them here. But we do have that need. And somehow Darwinism began to fill a new need as people were casting away. God is dead, Nietzsche said. And people needed something new to believe in. And Darwinism kind of provided that need. Now then, this is the Natural History Museum in London, which was opened in 1881. So in London and in other great cities, new cathedrals were built in honour of this new religion and its founder. I should say that, I regard Darwinism as a religion. I think, it's got all the tenets of a religion. And I'm going to show you those as we go on here. And like any religion, it needed to have a showy outward exterior to impress people that, yes, this is just as serious, this is just as important as that old-fashioned Christianity, which we're starting to move away from. They've got magnificent buildings. They've got, Westminster Abbey, St. Paul's, other cathedrals all over the country and all over Europe and in America and other places. Well, we need to build some cathedrals too for this new learning, this new understanding. And they actually did that in 1881. The cathedral-like appearance of the Natural History Museum makes it clear that Darwinism was never simply a science. If this was just a science, you would build a functional building with laboratories in it where you could just carry on your experiments, and you might have a little lecture theatre somewhere, but you wouldn't build something with great big pillars in the front, towers, a great staircase leading in, a great portico, a triforium over it. Those are the qualities you get with a medieval, actually Romanesque in this case, cathedral. Its facade and grand entrance were intended to both awe and reinforce the legitimacy of the new religion. The massive hall inside the museum carries on the sense of a grand cathedral. Now, in this hall, there used to be, till quite recent, or just I think the last couple of years, there was the skeleton, or actually it was a plaster cast of a skeleton, which is in America, of a diplodocus or diplodocus, which is a kind of brontosaurus with a long neck and long tail, great big thing. I remember that as a boy. You would come in there, and, oh, wow, this thing's huge. Children love dinosaurs, don't they? And the bigger the better. And so they put the biggest one they got in the hallway there as you come in. Whoa! Now they've replaced that, because that's not serious enough for the modern taste. And they've put the skeleton of a blue whale in there. And the blue whale is actually the largest animal that's ever existed. Of course, it lives in the sea, so it hasn't got to support all that great weight on feet like a dinosaur would. But that's what they've done. And the staircase at the end of the hall led up to a huge seated statue of Darwin himself. As prophet, he was both saint and lawgiver, a kind of Moses for the new creed of evolutionism. And I think they've actually put that statue back there, but I haven't been in there recently to check. Above him were stained glass windows, again like a cathedral. Around the Great Hall were and are satellite, we can call them chapels, where the exhibited fossils explained the new religions, neophytes, that's people, the newcomers. It was a truly grandiose statement, typical of the Victorian era. You know, you don't do things by half in the Victorian era. And there can be no doubt that the cult of Darwinism was already well established by the time the Natural History Museum was opened in 1881. Remember, his book was published in 1859, so that's 22 years later that they opened this magnificent, great museum, which is really a cathedral-like building. And Darwin's many admirers, drawn from the highest echelons of Victorian society, gave worship in this new Cathedral of Enlightenment. And this is actually the sort of opening ceremony, I think, when they're all gathered there and are reading out speeches, and there's the statue. And next to it is Darwin himself. I've arrowed him there. You can compare the features with the statue. The man himself, by then 71, looking slightly embarrassed, stands sheepishly, hands behind his back, in the presence of his godlike statue. And he died the following year. I don't know if he died of embarrassment, perhaps not. But I know that he was not wholly satisfied himself with what he had done. He certainly had qualms about it. But, you know, he felt he had to press forwards and do what he had to do. And today, some 140 years after the death of Charles Darwin, his theory of evolution is regarded not as a theory, but as scientific fact. And I should point out, here we got the famous collection running from the sort of chimpanzee up to modern man of, you know, you've got all the different early forms of man, Australopithecus and, I don't know, various other ones, leading up to modern man on the right. But, you know, we've still not found the so-called transitional species from the ape to early man, the hominids. You know, people are searching. They find the odd little tiny bone here and there, the odd tooth of something, and then they invent, or I shouldn't use that word, they figure out from the little evidence they have of what that person, that hominid, might have looked like. So evolution is taught in all respectable schools and universities, certainly in Britain and in most of the rest of the Western world. I should actually say most of the world, not just the Western world. And there are places where they don't teach it, but basically this is regarded as just truth. To challenge Darwin's theory is to be labelled a crank, yet it should be remembered that it is still only a theory. And like all of science, it stands only till a more plausible theory is developed to replace it. There is no such thing as settled science. Science is an ongoing endeavour to discover the truth. Now, I'm just going to stop there for a minute. You know, I studied science at university, and one of the things we were taught was that science doesn't stand still. There's never a situation where you say, well, this is the truth now. We've got it. Yeah, it's in the bag. Settled. No more argument. No more discussion. That's it. This actually is what's been happening with so-called climate change. They used to call it global warming, but that was too restrictive, so they changed it to climate change. And then we're told by people like Al Gore, who's not even a scientist, that is now settled science. A majority of scientists agree with this. Matters settled, no argument. If you do dispute this, you're a climate change denier. You should be thrown into the outer darkness. That's the language of a religion, not science. Yeah, we're not talking about climate change here. I'm just using it as an example. But this is true of all science, and it's true also of Darwinism, that it's not settled. It's a theory. You hold that theory, and you say, well, we haven't got anything better, so we'll stick with this. But you're looking for new theories. You don't just say, well, that's it, it's done. That's not the way science works. Here are some inconsistencies in Darwin's theory. I expect you're waiting for that. Now, many insects have developed camouflage techniques to make themselves virtually invisible against their background of leaves or twigs. Now here you can see a few. A sort of leaf insect who's camouflaged to look like the leaf that he stands on. Another insect, he's grown this great dead leaf on his back. I mean, he can wander around in the leaf litter at the below the tree, and any predator looking for a quick snack is just going to think, well, that's just a dead leaf. Got one here that looks like a twig, and as long as he stands still, the predator that might like to eat him is going to think, well, that's just a twig there, and it won't even notice it. It'll just be on looking for something else, an earwig or a spider or something that it can eat. And then there are others. For example, various species of moth, which take on the appearance of a predator that's more dangerous than whatever might like to eat them. For example, an owl moth. There's an owl moth. I mean, it looks like an owl. Now, if you're a little mouse or something and you're thinking, I'm looking for something to eat, and you see that, you think, oh my God, and you bolt because you think that might be an owl. You don't even want to investigate to see if it really is an owl. You know what owls look like. You know they're very dangerous and they're going to eat you. So you run. Alternatively, there's a caterpillar that looks like a poisonous snake. Now, if you're a frog and you're wandering around looking for something to grab with your tongue and eat, and then you see that, you go, oh Christ, there's a snake there, I've got to get out, and you run, or you hop. He doesn't say Christ, he doesn't speak English. But anyway, you run, and you leave that caterpillar alone. Now, it's hard to see how such adaptations could come about by chance. You don't evolve towards a successful camouflage strategy in baby steps. In other words, you're not making these, Darwin was saying you make these small incremental steps, slightly larger beak, slightly different colour feathers perhaps. Over a long period of time, the species kind of changes. That's not going to happen incrementally to give you perfect camouflage against the leafy background. It either works or it doesn't work. If it's not fully there, you've got no advantage. You see that? So if you've only slightly darker brown skin, that's not going to help you if you're standing on a green leaf. Or if you're slightly greener looking, that's not going to help you. You're still, they know what to look for. You've got to have the whole Monty. You've got to be the whole thing. And that doesn't happen in incremental stages. It's not possible. Then there are also anomalies in the plant world. Plants that need insects to pollinate them usually produce nectar and showy flowers to attract them. Were they aware of insects? I mean, this daisy, I presume it's a daisy of some sort. It's got this hoverfly on it. Do daisies have an intelligence that there are things called hoverflies flying around? And if I make a bit of nectar, I'm going to attract the fly. He's going to come and land on me. And he's going to pick up some pollen, and he goes to another flower. And he's going to pollinate that. And hopefully he'll have had some pollen on him to pollinate me. I mean, is that how it goes on? And some plants use a different strategy. Bee orchids and butterfly flowers mimic the insects they want to attract. And you look at those bee orchids, they look very much like a flower with a bee standing on top of it. The insect sees a mating opportunity. In other words, what he's seeing is, right, there's a female bee there, and here's a chance. And the insect sees a mating opportunity, but in reality is being tricked by the flower into carrying pollen from plant to plant. And the way these bee orchids work is the insect, or the bee, lands on the thing, and it's designed so that it puts a blob of pollen on the back of the insect. It actually does that physically. The stamens, I think they're the stamens, aren't they? Plonk the pollen on the back of the bee, and then he goes off to the next one, and that gets picked up and fertilizes that plant. I mean, come on. I mean, how would the plant, mutate to this incrementally? Maybe start off, I'll look a bit like a hoverfly, shall I? And oh well, there's more bees around. I'll look like, doesn't work. This is ridiculous. And a more common strategy is to use scent markers to attract insects. Sometimes plants will emit a scent of rotten meat. This attracts certain types of flesh-eating flies who are tricked into thinking a meal awaits them. Actually, sometimes, sorry, I didn't leave that on for you. Sometimes they don't even get a meal. Sometimes these are just lures to get the fly to go into the plant where it gets eaten. I mean, this is unbelievable. I mean, how did Darwin, I mean, maybe he didn't know about these things, but the idea that the plant could know what smell to make to attract kind of flesh-eating fly that's buzzing around to go into it and pollinate it, or to produce the right smell and attract her to get flies to go in, like in a pitcher plant, for example, that it can swallow them up and digest the fly. That doesn't happen in incremental stages. Now, I want to go into some analogies with the computer world, because the world of computing has a lot in common in many respects with the development of biological coding. Now, Darwin published his On the Origin of Species in 1859, which is nearly a century before Colossus, the first electronic computer. This was used by Alan Turing to break the code of the German Enigma machine. This was in the Second World War in the 1940s. And computers use numerical binary code. I mean, you've heard of this, ones and zeros. This is hard to interpret if you are a human. I mean, you look at a string of ones and zeros, you haven't a clue what that means. So modern programming languages were invented. Early languages were Fortran, Algol, and Cobol. Now, I've used Algol and Cobol myself. I used to be a computer programmer, so I do know a little bit about this. They needed to develop programming languages for the operator, or not the operator, the programmer to work in, to create the code for the computer to run on. But computers cannot read and process code written in languages such as COBOL. Computers don't speak English, and they don't even speak COBOL, which is a kind of variant on English, a very structured form that uses data words and so on, which we can understand, and we can understand the way that it's structured. But to a computer, if it's not ones and zeros, it doesn't mean anything to it. So the code must first be translated into machine-readable digital format, ones and zeros. It then looks like this. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen The Matrix. I'm sure many of you have. When you have a page on a screen that looks a bit like that, only it's sort of dribbling down and you can vaguely see images in it. It's very cleverly done, that, to get across this idea that computer code is both meaningful in terms of what the computer can read it as ones and zeros, but also the human beings can understand that this is producing pictures and data which corresponds to something physical and real that we can understand and work with. Now, in order to run a computer program, it's necessary to have a computer. Well, that should go without saying. And programs are stored as software, which is executed on demand by the CPU, and I've marked that there, or central processing unit. The CPU is a great big chip, usually, which sits underneath a fan to keep it cool inside your computer. Now, in 1954, Francis Crick and James Watson made their remarkable discovery of DNA. They determined that every organism has a unique DNA code that is contained in a double helix spiral. The complexity of this code is mind-bending and unique to each individual. So everything that lives has got its own DNA code, and it's unique. And you know that every person that lives, they've got their own DNA, and it's not the same as anybody else. We're like snowflakes. Well, And each one is different from each other. You know, we're very similar one to another. I mean, all humans are basically the same race, same species, but each individual is slightly different. You know that when you meet people in the street, they all look different, slightly different. And we all have our own quirks, we all have our own eccentricities, and we all have our own DNA code, which can be used. You know how it goes in police dramas, and they dab the DNA and they test it and they find out who the guilty person is who was holding the knife that killed the other. You know all that. And so we each have our own DNA code, which is very, very complicated. Further research revealed that the DNA code is based on just 4 nucleotide bases. These are called adenine, which is given the letter A, guanine, given the letter G, cytosine, given the letter C, and thymine, letter T. And these are arranged along the spine of the DNA molecule, resulting in a code that is remarkably similar to a computer code, only in quaternary rather than binary. In other words, you've got 4 possibilities, not just ones and zeros, but you can have an A, you can have a G, you can have a C or a T. And those are all arranged, and that's a quaternary, 4, quater, as opposed to 2 from bis, Latin for 2. What about the evolution of robots? Yeah, well, you know, you could think of the human being as being something like a robot. Well, if you have a robot, we know from experience that building robots is not easy. We also know that it's not enough to put together the hardware. We must also create software programs to run it. Yeah, so your robot has software to run it. It's not that hard to see that if you have something like a human being or any other animal, it needs software as well to run it. A lot of what you do, your breathing, your heartbeat, the way your kidneys work, everything, a lot of that, or most of it, is running automatically in the background. You're not even aware of what's going on. It's only when things go wrong that you become aware. So there's a lot of software that's running the machine in the background while you're busy thinking about breakfast and the girl that you fancy in the next office or whatever. Yeah, the machine itself is running in the background with its own programs. And why should we imagine that life forms are automatically programmed by chance? I mean, why would we think that we have to program a robot, but our own programming just happens, a little bit here, there, slight change here, and that's not how it works, is it? Programming something is highly complicated, and it's very, very critical. And I can tell you this, and I'll give you a little anecdote. I worked as a computer programmer for a few years, not that many, because I wasn't that good at it. But I was writing COBOL programs at the time, and I was working for a big company. I won't say their name. And the people in charge of the department asked me if I would do some changes, some coding in a particular program that was being accessed and used on terminals, by people. It's a big program. The printout was this thick, and there was no documentation with it. I mean, that's the real life. Supposedly in programming, you should always be writing up the documentation of everything that you've done, so someone coming in later who wants to amend that program can find out exactly what it's doing, what's going on, and what little changes or what that needs to change to do something different. That's how programming in the real world is meant to happen. But sometimes there isn't the documentation. It's either been lost, or it's never written, or the person left and they didn't bother. All sorts of things happen like that. So there I was, faced with this big, thick program, nothing to tell me how it works or whatever. But I worked my way through it, and I found the coding that needed changing, and I put in the changes that were needed. And it just happened that the next day I was on holiday. And I came back in the day after, and there were long faces. And I was dragged up, to the manager's office, and I was told that what I had done had crashed the entire network. all the terminals in the different offices had crashed because of my program change. What had I done wrong? But what I didn't know, because I didn't have the documentation, was that the field I had changed, and I'd added an extra, I think I'd added an extra digit to the field in the data. It all had to be set to low values. That's a sort of an initial figure. Because I hadn't done that, there were random amounts in that field in the computer mainframe memory, which hadn't been reset back to blanks at the start. And because of that, it had crashed the entire system. Now, I want you to understand this. I didn't get the sack for that, by the way. Everyone understood, thank God. But I want you to understand something. This idea of incremental tiny changes in a creature to its genetic coding is probably going to do the same thing. It's probably going to crash the programming that's running that creature. So this idea that just by chance grow a slightly larger bill, or by chance just change their feathers, or develop a new behavior that gives them an advantage, doesn't work like that. Not when you're talking about genetic coding and programming. Now, even a single-cell organism is vastly more complex than any computer. We know that if we wanted to create such a thing, it would require an enormous amount of work to program it. I can tell you that from experience. We also know that if you make random changes to the DNA code of an organism, it is far more likely to cause cancer or some other fatal disease than to modify it in a competitive way. And the difference in DNA code between species are profound, and it is impossible to believe that they are random. Furthermore, to go from a simple organism to a complex one requires complicated coding. Now, I just want to show you something on this picture here. You can see the double twist there, and you can see how there are these branches pointing inwards, and they don't actually touch the branch from the other side. And the lysine and the cytosine, those amino acids are attached to the tips of those spines which are pointing inwards, which are not touching the other side. And actually the DNA code is written twice, once on one strand and again on the other strand, but going in the opposite direction. So there's two copies within that DNA code, and it doesn't have any chemical function. The fact that these things are not connecting means that there's not a chemical purpose to why these molecules are put on the end of those spines. It's all to do with data. And this also is impossible to achieve by a series of random mutations. That's the complicated coding. There is not enough time in the universe. It would be far harder and take longer than a room full of chimpanzees would write even one play by Shakespeare, let alone his collective works. So the idea of random changes to the DNA code and the making of longer chains, adding them on and putting new bits and pieces in. I mean, this is just so complicated. It's just unbelievable, and it's just stupid. I think it's been worked out something like 10 to the 76 power. It would be like having a padlock on your bicycle. maybe has 3 digits on it, maybe 4 digits. And you can work out the number of codes. So if you've got 10 numbers on each roller, and then you've got 4 thingies on it, you've got 10 times 10 times 10 times 10. So you've got 10,000 possibilities there. So if you're randomly looking for the right number to unlock that padlock, you've got, 9,999 chances of it not being the right one if it's a 4-digit code. If you've got 10 to the 76, it means you've got 76 rollers. And the numbers just become impossible. It's more, it's bigger numbers than the number of stars in the universe that you'll pick out the right one. So it's the idea that these things just happen randomly is actually ridiculous. In other words, programming the DNA code, like modifying a computer program, requires intelligent input. And I can't stress that too strongly. Now, the man who I've got a lot of this information from is Dr. Stephen C. Mayer. Now, I do recommend that you go and have a look. He's got lectures on YouTube. He's written books. I'm reading Darwin's Doubt at the moment, one of his books. But do have a look at his work, because this man is a genius, and he's not to be just written off as a crank. And also, further information on this critical subject, see the works of Dr. Stephen Mayer, Director of the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute. He's written a number of books on intelligent design. That's what we're talking about, intelligent design. We're not talking about God making things in 7 days. We're talking about intelligent design. In other words, there has to be some intelligence behind the development of life forms. So there's a number of his lectures available on YouTube. So could Darwin's tree diagram be wrong? Fundamental assumption by Darwin is that species on the higher branches of the tree are genetically related to those lower down. Though implicit in Darwin's theory of evolution, this is not necessarily true. They might be unrelated and represent alternative creations with different causes. And in my next lecture, I'm going to investigate this by looking at the evolution of the steam engine. I used to be a train spotter. I confess, when I was 10 years old, I loved steam engines. And my friend John and I, we used to go up to London and we would go around the engine sheds looking at steam engines. We would sneak in over the barbed wire at the back, and we would be able to get up to these big monsters. We would be chased away, but we would have time to write the numbers down and maybe get up on the footplate before we were chased out. Of course, those days are gone. I'm talking 60 years ago or something. Those engine sheds have all gone. Places like Nine Elms that we used to go to, and there's now all sorts of other buildings there. But there's a lot to learn about the evolution of the steam engine, or the railways in general, and I'm going to use that as an illustration for how DNA coding comes about, and that will be in my next lecture in this series. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you then. Bye-bye.